Now, for simplicity, let's now imagine that the flex direction only has two states. And those two states are basically just flipping the axis. That's the only thing for now that we imagine that the flex direction can do. Now we have to give this some name, so we have to give some names to those two states. And the names that Flexbox is giving to them is, for one, the row state, and for the other, the column state. And now, what do they actually do? Now, the default in Unity, and I think that's a little bit contrary to the web world, because in the web world, the default is actually row, but in Unity, I think the default is the column state for flex direction. So when you basically throw in a visual element onto your canvas, it will by default be in a column state. If I'm not totally mistaken, that would be stupid, but now you just have two states, so it's just one or the other. It doesn't really matter, but I think in Unity, it's a column. And now what that means is in the moment where you decide for your flex direction to have a column orientation, your main axis is pointing from the top to the bottom. And obviously, then your cross axis just has to be the perpendicular axis and is then your horizontal axis. And then there is only one other way that you can have for the row state, and that would be that now the main axis is actually going horizontal and the cross axis is going vertical. And I hope that you can see one advantage of this as opposed to naming them as vertical and horizontal, because if you name them vertical and horizontal and you want to actually switch the axis, the names would also switch, and then in one state you had your horizontal axis, like what you would expect from a horizontal axis, but then when you would switch the axis, your horizontal axis would suddenly point top to bottom, and that would not make any sense. So that's the reason why they had to rename, they had to find this naming convention for their axis, because you want your elements to have, and your layout to have this possibility to switch axis and kind of reorient yourself, or you want to have a different direction for different elements. And in order to achieve that, it absolutely makes sense that you have this concept of a main axis that is kind of that is having its own rule sets that are always following your main axis. So whenever you are in row, your rule sets are going horizontally for the main axis. When you change the direction, your rule sets for the main axis are going vertically. And we will just see an example in a second. I think that will make it much clearer. So if you're still confused, I hope that now is the final step where we can resolve this, this confusion. Now, let's imagine we have a couple of elements and we want to lay them out onto our dark container element here. So we said that the default direction is column, and now what would happen if we would have a column direction and would just add the elements to this container? Now what happens first is that because we set the flex direction to column, we know that the main axis is the vertical axis, and that means that this is how the elements should be distributed, and that's what you would end up with. And this is one of those rules that I was speaking about, right? The rules are following the main axis, and the rule says wherever your main axis is pointing to, align your elements in that kind of direction. And accordingly, obviously, if we would have set the flex direction to row, now our main axis is the horizontal axis, and that's how the elements should be aligned. And again, I hope that it's starting to click a little bit with what they actually mean here with Flexbox, with the flex idea, that something is flexible, right? They don't want to have any fixed orientation for their elements. They just want to say, okay, I just want to set basically the flex direction. And just by setting the flex direction, I want my rule sets to automatically be applied, so that the element can either have a alignment of its children in a horizontal or a vertical way, just by setting this this flex direction, and by that resetting the main axis and the rules that that follow it. Now let's take a look at a slightly bigger example before we actually then go to Unity and apply this on hundreds of more real-world examples. So let's start now. One question that you might actually have is, now where are we actually what is the place where this flex direction is set? And this flex direction is always set on a particular element, and basically on the container element. So when I set the flex direction of this dark box to row, then this is kind of the rule set for how its items should be distributed or aligned. And so that means, let's imagine we set this to row, and now when we add two items, they are aligned along the main axis. That means we had two items that we added, and so they are aligned on the left and on the right. That means on a horizontal, with a horizontal alignment, because the main axis here is horizontal because it's a row. And now you keep playing this game, you are again setting a flex direction on the next element. Now, every element always has a flex direction. So that's not like something where you have three states where you can set column, row, or nothing. You always have one or the other, and by default in Unity, I think you have column. But so let's say that now those gray elements have a column flex direction, and that's again relevant for items that we add to this gray element. And when we would add a couple of items right now, they would be aligned like this, because they are now aligned vertically, because for column, the main axis is vertical. And let's just play this game one more time. Now that would could be a little quiz for you to say, okay, if now the row, if now this, I don't know, this reddish pinkish elements have a row orientation, what would happen to new items that we would add to it? And obviously they would be again aligned horizontally, because for row, the main axis is horizontal. Okay, so I hope this was not too confusing and that I've found a sort of way to explain this somehow. Now, what do we have to take away from all of this? You should have some understanding of what is a main axis. The main axis is the most important thing. The cross axis, you can always say, is just the other axis. There are some rules that follow the main axis, like, for example, that elements are aligned along the main axis. Along the main axis of the parent, of course. So here, the dark element had a main axis of row. Row means horizontal, and that's why those two gray elements are aligned next to each other, not on top of each other. Then the next thing that you should have now some understanding now is the idea of a flex direction, which are basically two states how we can set our orientation, and that's basically what is deciding where the main axis is. And they are called in Flexbox row and column. Now, technically, there are two more states, but they are just basically the reversed states, and let's not get confused by those right now. So let's for now just imagine there are two states for flex direction. The flex direction is deciding where the main axis is pointing to, and then the elements are aligned along the main axis. Okay. Let's now look at a couple of examples in Unity, and I hope if this is still confusing that it will get a bit clearer in a couple of minutes.